is one of the most outrageous things I have heard in a long, long time.
In a case that has been filled with outrageous.
And then looks at Wendy and says, you know, you had a great career. Your career is over. It is never coming back. You're done. Why would a judge say that?
You know, in a court proceeding that has nothing to do with Wendy's career. Moreover, that were made in front of Wendy Williams. If true, that is outrageous because this judge, one, she's not in the entertainment industry, so I don't know where she would get off opining about that and why that's even relevant to her role as a judge, who's basically the judge of the law, and in this case, judge of the facts.
I can't figure out, why is there a gag order in this case that Wendy can't talk about her circumstances? Why is the judge doing it?
That aside,
there is something
that's even
way, way bigger.
The judge in the guardianship.
The judge in the guardianship read Alex Finney, the Riot Act, threatened her and said, you're talking, making an accusation that she's talking to the media, and if you continue doing it, I'm going to do this to you, I'm going to do that to you. There is a gag order in this case. I can tell you that the judge has scared a lot of people involved in the case.
Every time she made a mention to hip hop culture, it was something that was wrong with it. And it was something that was on my CD that was the largest debut in hip hop.
That just goes to show you how far the homosexual movement within hip hop and sports still needs to go.
One of the most shocking questions in entertainment right now is this. If Wendy Williams does not have the illness that was used to justify taking control of her life, then why is she still not free? Think about that. A woman who built one of the most recognizable brands in daytime television. A woman who spent decades interviewing celebrities, exposing scandals, controlling conversations, is now reportedly living in a facility where she says she has limited freedom, limited access, and little control over her own decisions. And according to explosive reports, the very medical diagnosis that helped justify this situation may no longer stand. That changes everything. Because if the central medical reason for keeping Wendy Williams under guardianship has been seriously challenged, then this story is no longer just about health. It becomes a legal story, a power story, and for some people, an entertainment industry story. Because now the internet is asking questions that would have sounded absolutely unbelievable just a few years ago. Was Wendy Williams truly placed under protection for her own safety? Or did something much darker happen behind the scenes? And before we go any further, let's be crystal clear. This is a story involving court proceedings, reported medical claims, public interviews, and allegations discussed by various public figures. Some parts are established public record. Other parts remain disputed. And some theories circulating online are exactly that. Theories. But the timeline itself, that timeline raises serious questions. Because when you put everything together, something does not feel right. To understand why this case has become so explosive, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the headlines, not to the social media outrage, to the actual beginning. The story did not begin because Wendy's family went to court claiming she was unable to function. That's important. It began because of a bank. In 2022, Wells Fargo reportedly raised concerns about Wendy Williams' finances. According to reports, the bank believed Wendy may have been vulnerable to financial exploitation or undue influence. That alone triggered a legal chain reaction. A court became involved. Temporary protections were put into place. Then those protections evolved into something much bigger. And once the legal system gets involved in this kind of situation, things can move fast, especially when questions about capacity begin entering the conversation. At first, some people assumed this would be temporary, a short-term measure, a financial safeguard. But then came the diagnosis. And that's where everything changed. Because once doctors reportedly diagnosed Wendy with serious cognitive issues, the narrative shifted completely. Now this was no longer framed as a financial concern. It became a capacity issue, a guardianship issue, and eventually, a freedom issue. The diagnosis people kept hearing about was devastating. Frontotemporal dementia, alongside aphasia. Now for anyone unfamiliar, frontotemporal dementia is not usually discussed as something temporary. It's a degenerative neurological condition, meaning worsening over time, not improving. That distinction matters enormously, because if someone is diagnosed with a degenerative illness affecting cognition, courts often treat that very differently than temporary health struggles. Once that diagnosis entered the public narrative, many assumed the conversation was over. Case closed. If Wendy had irreversible cognitive decline, then the restrictions made sense, at least legally. But then something happened that completely changed public perception. Wendy herself began speaking, and what people heard did not match what they expected. When Wendy Williams began publicly speaking about her condition, the public reaction was immediate, because many expected confusion, disorientation, severe impairment. Instead, they heard someone sounding coherent, frustrated, angry, aware, and emotionally clear. One of the most talked about moments came when Wendy described her living situation in deeply emotional terms. She reportedly said she felt like she was in a prison. That phrase spread everywhere, because it instantly changed the emotional framing. This was no longer just Wendy receiving care. Now people imagined confinement, isolation, control, and suddenly public sympathy exploded. Because regardless of what the legal details were, hearing Wendy herself say she felt trapped changed everything. Then came family members speaking publicly, describing restricted communication, limited access, tight oversight, and that only intensified suspicion. Because now people weren't just asking if Wendy needed protection. They were asking how much control had actually been taken from her, and whether that control was still justified. This is where things got messy, because the public started comparing two competing realities. Reality number one: court-approved guardianship based on serious health concerns. Reality number two: a Wendy Williams who, at least in interviews, sounded lucid enough to understand what was happening. That contradiction fueled online debate. Now, obviously, cognitive issues are complex. Someone can have moments of clarity. Someone can sound articulate in short conversations. That alone proves nothing. But perception matters, and the public began noticing inconsistencies. Then came reports of a new evaluation. And suddenly, the entire story shifted again. Because if those reports were accurate, then the foundation of this entire guardianship could be in serious question. Here, where this story becomes explosive, reports began circulating that a top neurologist conducted extensive testing. And according to those reports, the conclusion was shocking. No evidence supporting frontotemporal dementia. If true, that is massive. Because remember, frontotemporal dementia was widely understood to be central to the justification for Wendy's lack of independence. So if a later specialist reportedly ruled it out, people naturally ask, then what exactly is the legal justification now? That question is not conspiracy. That is basic logic. If diagnosis A was the reason, and diagnosis A no longer applies, what replaces it? And if nothing replaces it, why does the guardianship remain? That's exactly why this story exploded online. Because suddenly the narrative changed from Wendy is seriously incapacitated to wait, then why is she still there? Then Wendy's lawyer added fuel to the fire. Publicly, this mattered because lawyers choose words carefully, especially in high-profile legal matters. And when her attorney spoke publicly, the messaging was striking. The argument was essentially simple. If the dementia diagnosis does not stand, then the legal basis for ongoing restrictions becomes dramatically weaker. That's why some statements were interpreted almost like, "Game over. Case finished." Except, it was. Because despite all the headlines, despite the outrage, despite the questions, Wendy was still not free. And that's where frustration intensified. Because from the outside, this now looked like a contradiction. If the evidence changed, why hadn't the outcome changed? Was the system moving slowly? Was there additional evidence the public didn't know about? Or was something else happening? That uncertainty created a vacuum. And whenever there's a vacuum, speculation rushes in. This is where the story stops being only about medicine and law and starts becoming about power. Because once confusion grows, people start connecting unrelated dots. And in Wendy's case, some online commentators began asking whether powerful entertainment relationships played any role in her broader downfall. Now let's be very careful here. There is a major difference between verified evidence and internet speculation. That distinction matters. But it's impossible to ignore the fact that certain names repeatedly come up in public discussion. One name in particular, Oprah Winfrey. And that's where things become far more controversial. Because Wendy and Oprah had a complicated history, a very public one. And some people believe that history matters. Whether it actually does, that's a separate question. But the speculation exists. Before we go any further, let's establish something clearly. There is no verified public evidence proving Oprah Winfrey had anything to do with Wendy Williams' guardianship. None. No court filing. No documented communication. No verified insider proof. That matters, because serious claims require serious evidence. However, that has not stopped online speculation. And the reason speculation exists is because Wendy and Oprah did not exactly have a warm public relationship. For years, Wendy built a career saying what other people would never say out loud. That included comments about some of the most powerful names in media. Including Oprah. Wendy criticized, mocked, questioned, and sometimes crossed lines people in entertainment usually avoid crossing. That was her brand. Fearlessness, provocation, unfiltered commentary. But when you repeatedly challenge powerful people publicly, some audiences naturally wonder whether consequences follow. Again, wondering is not evidence, but understanding why people wonder matters. Because this is where the public narrative started becoming much bigger than the actual legal case. For years, Wendy Williams was untouchable in daytime gossip television. Her format worked because she could say things traditional hosts wouldn't. She mixed celebrity news with sharp commentary, sometimes brutally sharp, and audiences loved it. She became culturally unavoidable. Then everything changed. Health issues started affecting appearances. Production disruptions followed. The future became uncertain. And eventually, her show ended. Now, from a business perspective, networks replacing struggling hosts is not unusual. Television is ruthless. Ratings matter. Schedules matter. Reliability matters. But emotionally, fans saw something different. They saw Wendy disappear while another host stepped into the same space. And that emotional transition fueled resentment. Not because replacements are inherently wrong, but because audiences get attached. Then, when certain powerful media figures publicly embraced the replacement, internet theories exploded. Was it normal industry support? Or something deeper? Again, evidence matters, but perception is powerful. And perception was spiraling. Part of why this story hit so hard is because the public has seen conservatorship controversies before. The most obvious comparison: Britney Spears. Now legally. These are very different cases. Different jurisdictions. Different facts. Different medical claims. Different timelines. But emotionally, the public saw similarities. A celebrity. Restricted autonomy. Questions about capacity. Fans demanding answers. And once the Britney case changed public awareness, people became far less trusting of systems involving celebrity control. That context matters, because years ago, many people automatically assumed courts knew best. Now, audiences ask harder questions. And in Wendy's case, those questions kept multiplying, because the details sounded unsettling. Restricted communication, claims of limited independence, financial control, medical uncertainty. It created a perfect storm. And then family voices made everything even louder. One of the most emotionally powerful parts of this entire story has been hearing family members speak publicly. Because family changes perception. Lawyers can sound strategic. Commentators can sound opportunistic. But family feels personal. And when relatives describe concern, frustration, or helplessness, people listen differently. That doesn't mean family members always know every legal detail. But emotionally, their voices carry weight. Some public commentary painted a picture of isolation, of restrictions, of Wendy lacking meaningful autonomy. That kind of messaging is incredibly powerful because it humanizes the issue. Now the public is no longer thinking abstractly about legal guardianship. They're imagining a real person. Alone, dependent, controlled, and emotionally. That image is devastating, especially for someone whose public identity was built around independence and confidence. Wendy was never perceived as fragile, which makes this reversal feel especially dramatic. One explanation people offer is simple: legal systems move slowly. And that's true, especially when medical disputes are involved. Courts are cautious, sometimes frustratingly cautious. A diagnosis changing does not automatically end legal oversight overnight. Procedures exist. Evaluations happen. Evidence gets reviewed. Motions are filed. Hearings occur. That's normal. But here the problem. To frustrated observers, slow process can look identical to unnecessary delay. And that distinction becomes politically explosive. Because if the public believes the medical rationale collapsed, then every additional day feels suspicious, even if legally there are reasons. That's why this story keeps gaining traction. The uncertainty creates emotional outrage. And emotional outrage demands villains, which is exactly why speculation keeps spreading. Years ago, stories like this unfolded quietly. Courtrooms, legal filings, traditional media. Today, everything becomes internet discourse. Every clip gets dissected. Every quote gets weaponized. Every facial expression becomes evidence. That creates a dangerous environment because nuanced legal situations get reduced to emotional narratives. Free Wendy, system abuse, celebrity silencing, corruption. Some of these narratives may contain legitimate concerns. Others may be wildly speculative. But once social media locks onto a story, complexity disappears. Everything becomes simplified. Heroes, villains, conspiracies. And Wendy's story became the perfect internet case. A beloved celebrity, health uncertainty, power imbalance, celebrity industry whispers, legal opacity. It has every ingredient, which is why the conversation exploded far beyond actual court filings. This is the hardest question, because public perception based on interviews is not medical evidence. Someone sounding coherent in conversation does not automatically mean full legal independence is appropriate. That's just reality. Cognitive conditions are complicated. Decision-making capacity can be nuanced. Functioning in one context doesn't equal functioning in all contexts. That said, if specialists truly dispute the original diagnosis, then the public naturally expects transparent reassessment. That expectation is reasonable. The challenge is that much of what matters may exist in private medical documentation. Not public clips, not interviews, not internet theories. And because the public lacks full access, people fill gaps with assumptions. That's where narratives become dangerous. Any guardianship case involving significant wealth raises one uncomfortable question. Who controls the money? That question alone fuels suspicion. Because once finances become centralized, people wonder about incentives. Again, suspicion is not proof. But perception matters. If the public sees restricted autonomy plus financial control plus prolonged oversight, they naturally ask whether incentives are aligned correctly, especially when celebrity wealth is involved. That's why transparency becomes so important. Because absent transparency, every decision gets interpreted through distrust. And Wendy's celebrity status amplifies that distrust dramatically. At its core, this story may be less about Wendy specifically, and more about public trust. Do people trust institutions handling vulnerable celebrities? Increasingly, no. That distrust didn't begin here. Britney accelerated it. Past entertainment scandals reinforced it. And Wendy's case arrived in an environment already primed for skepticism. So even if every legal action was procedurally justified, public confidence may still collapse if communication feels opaque. And right now, opacity defines this story. That's why speculation thrives. Because unanswered questions are oxygen for internet narratives. And now the biggest question remains. If this is simply a careful legal process, why does it feel so secretive?